I am C.A. Fletcher. I am C.A. Fletcher, and today I'm going to talk through some books on writing. I think there are sort of three categories of books on writing that I'm going to step through. One is sort of a soft introduction to books on writing. These are things like the memoir guide. So in this section I'll talk about Stephen King's On Writing, Chuck Palahniuk's Consider This, and two books by Charles Bukowski. I'm going to go through some books that fall into a second category, which have a bit more meat to instructing you how to write. These are going to be Dreyer's English by Benjamin Dreyer, two books, the Little Red Writing Book and the Little Green Grammar Book by Tredinnick, an Australian professor, and then Strunk and White's Elements of Style. The last section that I'll briefly go through are the Bibles, the reference texts. These are, once you've gone through the others and you're really trying to polish your writing, these are where you go to make sure that it's actually saying what you think it says. And then there's a fourth category that I'll save to the end. So the first book in the first category is On Writing by Stephen King. Its subtitle is A Memoir of the Craft, which is quite proper. It's definitely a memoir on the craft rather than an instructional book. But there were some takeaways that I think were useful. He said that you should refine your toolbox. One thing that's very important is vocabulary. You'll hear a lot about voice and whatever that nebulous concept is supposed to mean. But in this, Stephen King very aptly and correctly says that you should stick to the words that you would normally say to describe that. Now, I would take it a little bit broader than that and say that you should stick to the words that your character would say. I don't ascribe to the school of thought that you should only write specifically what you know. I think it's perfectly fine for people, and in fact it's very interesting for people to write about what goes beyond their own personal experience. Of course, with respect and threading in their own experience. To that extent, I think Stephen King's suggestion of your vocabulary should be the words that you say first, or the words that you would normally say. I think you can go a bit broader than that and say that you should try to stick to the words that your character would normally say. I'm not sure if you can hear that, but there's an Asian woman. There's a woman taking a trolley up the path. The second tip that I gleaned from Stephen King's On Writing is grammar. There are some fundamentals. I don't think Stephen King's book is a good place to find that at all. There are books further down this list that I'll talk about. Those are books that are better placed to provide a budding writer with their grammar tips. The last and sort of related tidbit that I was able to extract from On Writing is style and where to get it from. Stephen King doesn't prescribe a style or how to get a style, but he certainly instructs readers to go to Strunk and White's The Elements of Style, which I think is a okay place to start. I'll give some of my thoughts on that book later, but above all, two key points that Stephen King made in this little book, I say little, is to avoid adverbs and to avoid the passive voice. Adverbs, she quickly ran, she sprinted, there's probably a better word for it. And the passive voice, I hate the passive voice. Rarely is there ever a good time to use the passive voice. Passive voice is where the subject of the sentence is either unknown or is having the verb, rather the object is having the verb done to it, or the verb is being done by the subject. They're awful sentences. Things like the letter was sent by the firm. Awful. So-and-so, Joe Bloggs, sent the letter. Worse is where you don't have the by, so you don't even know who the subject of the sentence is. It's just awful. The last thing that I gleaned from Stephen King's On Writing is to write with the door closed and rewrite with it open. I don't so much agree with the door closed open aspect of it. what he's trying to get at there, as I understand it, is that you should write your initial draft in secrecy. Keep it private. Don't share it with your wife or husband, or whoever you live with. Don't share it with your friends, your writing group, etc. Keep your first draft to yourself. I'm not sure I agree with that. What I do agree with is rewriting. You don't really have a story until you rewrite, and most stories end up telling themselves. Unless you're sticking very, very closely to the tropes of a certain genre, books are going to write themselves rather than you write them. So you don't actually know what the story is until you've written it. That means by the time you get to the 20th chapter, you're 50,000 words in, 80,000 words in, however many words in, and you realize that your main character needs to go and find a diary. But you're realizing, I haven't mentioned this diary once in the past bit. So that's where the rewriting comes in. And it's a very important part of the process. That's something that Bukowski disagrees with, that I'll turn to after discussing the next book in the list, which is Chuck Palahniuk's Consider This. I've actually been diving in a lot into Chuck Palahniuk's work. I haven't read anything by him. I have, however, obviously, because I'm a male under the age of 30, seen the movie based on his book Fight Club. I have, however, read this, and there's a lot to take away from it. It is another memoir, but unlike King's on writing, it's a lot more concrete. Gives some real, concise, very, precise tips on how to improve your writing. I'll not go through each of those, but at page 211 of the copy that I've got, he provides a sort of troubleshooting guide, and some of it is just absolutely profound. I mean, one of the problems, your narrative voice is boring. He implores you to consider, read it out loud. Ask yourself if you varied sentence length and construction. Do you balance dialogue with physical action and gesture? Do you mix different textures of communication? Those are all things that he elsewhere in the book has already described how to do those things, how to spot them, how to change them. So that's one example, and it's a really good sort of touchstone to go back to. So for that alone, I'd highly recommend any budding writers buying Chuck Palahniuk's Consider This. That takes me to the third and fourth, but the third book, which is Charles Bukowski's On Writing and the Mathematics of the Breath and the Way. Both of these are slightly different. On Writing is a memoir, at least how I would view a memoir, without any filtering. It's a collection of his letters and similar sort of personal writings, I believe collected posthumously. And so there's a lot in there that's unfiltered. There's some hot takes politically and socially, but outside of those, I mean, the man was a product of his time. Outside of those, between this and the Mathematics of the Breath and the Way, there are some real nuggets of writing, and Bukowski really was one of the best of his era. For example, on style, what I took away from these books is that every sentence needs to be able to stand alone, but that you should otherwise, when talking about style, you should otherwise write how you want, how you damn well please. Ignore rules. Start sentences with an and or a but. Have sentences that don't have a verb, if that's what the situation calls for. We often talk like that in natural conversation. I'm sure I've probably said a few sentences that don't have a verb in them during this video. Do it, why not? Do what you want. Another thing is Bukowski implores you to not try to emulate anyone. I think this is true when talking about finished work, but I'll talk about this a little bit later, but there is something to emulating for practice someone that you do like and the style that you do like. It's a good exercise to spot what aligns with your voice naturally and what doesn't. And the last thing I took away from Charles Bukowski's books is the prevalence of rejection. That's something that Stephen King touched on On Writing. Charles Bukowski said it as well. There's a phrase in there that I'll not quote, but to the effect that he made $47 over 20 years of writing, which amounts to about $2 a year, which when you take away postage and typewriting, ribbon fees and all the rest of it, he probably is at a net negative at that point. But he says that that's just part of it. If you're being an artist, you're not doing it for the money. Stephen King, one of the most prolific and probably commercially successful authors, also touched on the same point in On Writing, and he has that oft quoted phrase of if at first you don't succeed, get a bigger nail, referring to the nail that he put in his wall when he was a child and started sending off stories, and he eventually ran out of space on the nail for his rejection slips, so he went off and got a bigger nail. The next section of sort of books on writing the next category of books on writing that I want to talk about but not spend too much time on are the more instructive guides that don't quite fall into the reference texts but also don't fall into the traditional author memoir with a little bit on craft thrown in. Those are Dreyer's English, the two Little Red Guides by Tredinnick. His full name doesn't appear anywhere on the cover of the book, so I'll have to leave it as Tredinnick, and The Elements of Style by Strunk and White. I'll not go into each of these in detail, but what I would say is Dreyer's English, fantastic jumping off point if you want to understand some fundamentals of what you can and cannot do to be clear and stylish. Dreyer, Benjamin Dreyer, was Random House's chief copy editor, so the man certainly knows his stuff. The two, I misspoke earlier, Mark Tredinnick. His Little Green Grammar Book and Little Red Writing Book are both pretty good. I would certainly say the Little Red Writing Book is better. The Little Green Grammar Book covers some grammar points. There's a lot of fluff in there. I would say there are better places to get your instructions on grammar. However, the Little Red Writing Book, it was eye-opening. I'm not sure if the little I symbol on the front is intentional, but it really was eye-opening. There are exercises in here that teach you about set types of sentences, unhappy sentences, clarity, getting deep, writing to say something beyond what you're saying in the writing. It's just a fantastic little book, relatively inexpensive for this type of book, and I very highly recommend it. The last then in this section is Strunk and White's Elements of Style. Undoubtedly, you will find this referred to in almost all the others, and that's because this was originally written, I believe, in the 1800s by two old white fellas in England, no less. I'll not hold that against them. At least I think it was England. I'm going to proceed on the assumption it was England. This is very prescriptive. Tells you what to do and what not to do, and there's a lot of it that's very out of date. For example, where to put a possessive S with words that end in S. Different countries do it differently, different voices do it differently, different characters will do it differently within your narrative. Those types of rules aren't necessarily things that you should adopt. However, given how slim this little volume is, it is something you should pick up and be aware of. If you're breaking the rules, it helps to know what the rules are so that you can break them properly and in the right places. The next two are hefty books, so bear with me. Reference texts. There are several of those books that I've been through just earlier talk about the importance of having a good dictionary, a good usage dictionary, and a thesaurus. I don't have a physical dictionary in my writing office. Instead, what I use for my dictionary is this wonderful thing that you're using, the internet. It's much, much quicker to use as a dictionary when all you simply want to know is the definition of a word. If it's purely just to make sure that you're confused between two words, you want to make sure you're using the right one. Or if you're using a word and you're not entirely sure that it means what you think it means. Or when you read something, it's so much quicker just to Google it, let Google tell you the definition. If you don't like Google's definition, you can scroll through and find dictionaries publicly available for free, and it's so much quicker than looking it up physically. However, something like Garner's Modern English Usage is not something you can find online. Usage is different from definition. Usage tells you the social connotations that are attached to words, or how they're often misspelled or misused, what versions of a word or homophone or whatever is more in vogue, which is important. You don't want to have your an S in the wrong place of a spelling of a word that's technically correct. Give your writing the air of archaicness, if that's a word. There's a lot in here, and Garner is one of the preeminent men, authors, whatever, on the English language. And so this is something that I would highly recommend. It was actually a Christmas gift, I should say. So thank you to so-and-so who gave me that. Another Christmas gift, and the other type of book you want, is a thesaurus. Now, a typical thesaurus, you look up a word and there'll be a list of words underneath it which have similar or meanings, and often as well there'll be antonyms. This is something the internet can provide you. However, what Roget's thesaurus does differently is that it categorizes words into classes. So the original, you can see here, if it focuses, was broken into classifications: abstract relations, space, matter, intellect, volition, affections, change, causation. And so this is a much, much better place to find words when you're not sure how to describe something. You might be thinking that the character's thoughts need to move from point A to point B, but I don't know any word that describes that off the top of my head. So I would go into Roget's, find the section on thought, and there will be a subsection on movement of thought or change of thought. I can then go to that section and find a list of words that all satisfy that meaning. I would then look that up on a dictionary, and I might have somewhere to jump off from. There was an extra section I wanted to cover, and those are those behind me. The best way really to learn how to write is to read. Stephen King certainly refers to that, Chuck Palahniuk just refers to that. Who is it? Read. Werner Herzog even refers to that. The filmmaker, he says that to be a filmmaker you must read. And I completely agree. The best way to improve your writing is to read great works, whatever that may be. If you're writing fantasy, there's no reason why you necessarily need to read Infinite Jest. If you're writing fantasy, read great fantasy, and I guarantee your writing will improve. Same goes for literary fiction, whatever you're writing. Short stories, read some great ones and really think about them. And the books that I've discussed here will help you have a framework to sort of analyze what you're reading and understand why it gives you that emotional pull. But ultimately, you just have to read them.